It begins with a blue and white Fairchild jet and a rugby team full of jokes, nicknames and plans. October 13th, 1972, Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crosses the southern Andes towards Santiago. The Andes are not just mountains, they're a wall, serrated, glacial and indifferent. When the aircraft clips a ridge and breaks apart, 29 people survive the initial brutality. They are young, athletic, hopeful, suddenly cast into a white world where the sky is a knife and the nights steal the warmth from your bones. The fuselage becomes a coffin-shaped shelter. The tail and wings are gone, the cockpit is mangled, and with it, the navigational certainty adults usually bring to chaos. There's no rescue in sight. Radio fragments whisper nonsense. The survivors gather inventory: a few chocolate bars, some candies, a little wine, shards of seat foam for insulation, thread pulled from clothes to stitch wounds, and snow, an ocean of snow to melt for water. They ration like monks. A square of chocolate becomes a sermon on self-control. By day, they sun themselves behind improvised goggles. By night, they curl together against the -30°C air that slips beneath their clothes like a thief. Every breath tastes of metal and fear. In those first hours, morality is intact and familiar. They pray, they comfort the injured, they tell each other that planes like theirs are found every day. But as the calendar moves, 3 days, 5 days, a week, hunger stops being a visitor and becomes a resident. Their stomachs, trained by sport to burn calories, begin to cannibalize their own bodies. Fingers tremble, thoughts slow. The cold becomes more than weather. It is an argument the mountain makes against human life. On day 8, a radio broadcast reaches the fuselage. The search has been called off. The survivors listen in a silence so complete that even the wind seems to pause. Families at home will hold masses and memorials. The mountain has been awarded custody. That night, something changes quietly and irreversibly. If no one is coming, then survival is not a story of waiting. It is a story of choosing. The first conversations about the bodies start wrapped in euphemism, like all terrible ideas do. They speak of protein, of the only resource left, of what the church might say. Many are devout Catholics. Death is not merely an end, but a passage, sacred, inviolable. Yet the bodies around them are not strangers. They are teammates, cousins, classmates, friends with shared jokes and borrowed sweaters. And still, the arithmetic is pitiless. The human body is the only food on this mountain. Roberto Canessa, a medical student, becomes a reluctant compass. He studies the terrain of a human body with the same humility he would bring to an anatomy lab, but the context is obscene. He doesn't thunder with authority, he reasons. He frames the idea not as a betrayal, but as a gift. If he himself died, he would want his body to help his friends live. In psychological terms, the group gropes for a narrative that can carry the moral weight. They find one. They are not desecrating the dead. They are accepting an extreme form of communion, life given so that life may continue. The debate stretches over days, fragmenting and reforming like blowing snow. Some argue, some weep, some turn their faces to the fabric of the fuselage and whisper apologies into the seams. There is no vote with raised hands. Consensus coagulates around the same cold facts. Autonomy is preserved. No one will be forced to eat. Those who cannot will not be judged. Those who can will do so quietly, reverently, carefully. They will avoid faces and hands, the markers of personhood, working instead with the hidden. They will pray before and after. They will remember the names. What does ethics look like when you are starving? It looks like a circle of boys and men who decide to live with the dead, not against them. It looks like accepting responsibility in a place where the world has abandoned you. It looks like discovering that morality can evolve under pressure without shattering. The decision does not erase the horror. It organizes it. It creates a boundary where there was only dread. From the outside, People will later ask, how could you? From the inside, the real question is, how could we not? In psychology, this is cognitive dissonance resolved by reframing. They see the act not as consumption, but as stewardship, not as theft, but as consent freely granted in extremis. Many survivors will say that they spoke to their friends in their hearts before taking the first bite and heard silence give them permission. On the mountain, after the first, the second becomes possible. Strength returns in small increments. The mind, finally fed, can plan, repair, explore, map, attempt the impossible. The choice does not make them heroes nor monsters. It makes them human in a circumstance designed to erase humanity. Only a sliver of people, maybe that 1%, will actually feel the cold through the page and understand what it means to be abandoned at altitude. The rest of us can only listen and try to imagine the taste of survival when there is no other flavor left. When the search was called off, the mountain changed shape. It was no longer a place they were passing through. It was a world with its own rules. Grief had two edges, one for the friends they had lost in the crash, and one for the future they realized they might never have. And inside that doubled sorrow, the most forbidden idea ripened. To live, they would have to accept the dead as providers. No one announced it like a leader from a stage. Leadership here was a tide, not a throne. It moved between people with practical skills or a steady gaze. Roberto Canessa's was steady. He was a medical student, yes, but also a teammate, accustomed to reading bodies, who was fading, who could carry, who could still make jokes at night. When the whispers about protein turned into sentences, Canessa did something crucial. He placed the idea inside a frame big enough to hold it. If I die, he reasoned aloud, I want you to use my body. I give you my consent. He spoke it as gift, not as sin. Others echoed him. Consent, once spoken in the present, seemed to travel backwards to the friends already gone, and forward to those who might yet die. It did not make the decision clean, but it made it shareable. Ethics, stripped of comfort, has to become communal. They set boundaries, rituals really, because ritual is how humans carry unbearable meaning. They would pray, they would not touch faces or hands, they would speak names, they would treat each cut of flesh not as a thing stolen, but as something entrusted. They would allow refusal, because moral agency must survive if the body is to. Those who could not participate would not be judged. Those who could would work discreetly and carry the weight. A few made the sign of the cross. Some cried, ashamed that tears could come before food. Some turned away the first time and the second, only to say yes on the third day when their knees buckled on the ice. From a psychological lens, the group was translating horror into a story they could inhabit without shattering. They appealed to necessity, survival, to theology, a form of communion, and to reciprocity, consent imagined and granted. This is not self-deception, it is self-preservation of the mind. Cognitive dissonance, I am a good person, versus I am doing what my culture forbids, was resolved by reframing the act. Not desecration but stewardship, not consumption but continuity. They anchored themselves with language because language is the handhold of the soul. Practicalities followed. Snow became a cutting board, shards of plexiglass and metal became knives. They learned where the body stores energy and where the cold had preserved it. They worked away from the group when they could, to spare the most sensitive an extra wound. In the beginning, the quantities were tiny, slivers the size of a coin, because the real barrier was not the scarcity of flesh, but the boundary in the mind. After the first swallow, something like warmth glowed at the edges of perception. The body, stalled for days, took the fuel and sent it forward. Thoughts sharpened by millimeters. Fingers remembered tasks. Plans, once just talk around a dead radio, began to take on dates. There was no unanimity, only convergence. One survivor confessed to feeling like he was betraying his mother's kitchen, a memory more sacred than any rule book. Another said he felt his friend alongside him, urging him on, because life, not heroism, not pride, was the legacy they all wanted for one another. Canessa, who had helped midwife the decision, did not grow harder. He grew more gentle. He spoke to those who struggled, not to convince them, but to say their struggle was allowed. Some held out for days after others began. No one kept score. The moral question did not end with the first bite. It had to be re-answered every day. They asked themselves, are we still the kind of people who honor promises? The answer had to be yes, or the mountain would have taken more than their calories. It would have taken their meaning. So they wrote notes to families in case they died on a later attempt. They promised to tell the story truthfully if they made it out. They kept each other from slipping into cruelty's shortcuts. Hunger can make people feral. They chose again and again to remain a team. From the outside, the controversy would later turn on labels. Cannibalism, a word so charged it can end a conversation before it starts. Inside the fuselage, the label was too small. What they did lived at the intersection of ethics and emergency, flesh and faith, science and soul. The 1% who truly understand are not those with iron stomachs, but those who can imagine themselves freezing on metal, counting the hours by the angle of a sun that gives light but no heat, listening for a search plane that will never come, and then asking their conscience, not their appetite, for permission to live. Only then does the consensus they forged make sense? Not unanimous, but human. Not pure, but honest. A choice made in daylight, with the dead as witnesses and the living as custodians. It is the scandal of survival and the seed of their rescue, because only with energy could they scout farther, climb higher, and dare the impossible path out. In that sense, the decision was not just about eating, it was about writing the next page. No one remembers the exact minute when thought became action. They remember the cold, the dull ache inside the bones, the way the wind threaded itself through the torn fuselage like a warning. They remember the hush that fell when a small group, those who had argued most clearly for consent and necessity, walked a little ways from the others, carrying a shard of plexiglass wrapped in cloth as if it were fragile. If morality has a sound in the snow, it is a breath held. Canessa was there, not as commander, but as witness and guide. He kept saying the same thing in different words. If I die, take what you need. I want you to live. It wasn't rhetoric. It was a contract he signed with his own body first. Parrado, whose eyes had the far look of someone already mapping a route out, nodded. Vito Strauch, practical and inventive, handled the tools with the tenderness of a surgeon and the economy of a farm boy. Each had a role that matched his temperament. They had set rules. No faces, no hands, no symbols of personhood. They would speak the names, they would pray, and they did. Voices overlapped in a ragged litany, for the dead, for the living, for forgiveness in a future they still believed might exist. Some made the sign of the cross, others pressed their faces into their scarves and cried into the wool. Hunger is not a drumbeat, it is a knife that carves away hesitation until only choice remains. The first cut was small, almost ceremonial. They did not want to brutalize the moment or themselves. Strauch's hands shook, not from cold but from the comprehension of what they were doing. Canessa steadied him. That tiny piece, no larger than a postage stamp, became a test not of appetite but of identity. Could they swallow and remain themselves? Could they honor their friends by not letting their deaths end in emptiness? The answer, agonizingly, was yes. One by one, those who had consented took the sacrament of survival. Later, people would ask why they used the word communion, because in that makeshift chapel of aluminum and sky, they needed a language that sanctified endurance. The dead, who could give nothing else, gave this. The living, who could take nothing else, received it with reverence. This is how cognitive dissonance resolves without breaking the self. You bind what you do to what you believe, not to excuse the act, but to carry it. A taboo is shattered, a vow is made. Not everyone participated that first day. A few turned away and kept turning away for days, insisting their faith required it. No one forced them. Moral agency was protected like a flame in wind. Canessa checked on them quietly, not to persuade, but to say their refusal was seen and respected. When some later joined, it was because their legs buckled when they tried to stand, because the stars looked like nails at night, because they heard in memory a friend's voice saying, "Live." Practicality followed ritual. They learned how to preserve, how to cut without dishonor, how to share without spectacle. Parcels were wrapped and hidden from the eyes of those still struggling. Rations were measured not by hunger, but by fairness. They built a moral economy where charity and restraint traveled together. Those stronger carried more outside, those weaker were carried more inside. The decision did not make them merciless, it obliged them to be gentler, because they were now custodians of their friends in the most literal way. Psychologically, something else shifted. Starvation fog had made their thoughts slow and brittle, easily shattered by despair. After eating, minds sharpened by degrees. Jokes crept back, shy, grateful creatures. The possibility of action re-entered the room. Parrado began speaking more concretely about an expedition west. Canessa, counting pulses and studying the map of snow ridges with his eyes, argued for scouting. Meaning returned, and with meaning responsibility. The choice had not ended their suffering, it had equipped them to carry it. From the warmth of our homes, we look for a cleaner path, a loophole that would spare them and satisfy us. There wasn't one. The mountain offered a single bargain. Only a very small percentage of people will feel that bargain in their bodies and understand why the survivors accepted it. Those who do are not less moral. They are more intimately acquainted with the boundary between principle and extinction. The rest of us, good, comfortable, can still learn from their candor. They did not hide, they did not glamorize, they did not lie to themselves about what it meant. That night, after the first day of the new law, sleep came harder. Relief and shame coexisted like two camps under the same dark. Some whispered apologies into the blankets. Some thanked their friends as if they were in the next seat. Canessa, eyes open, counted the heartbeats of the boys he could save if he could keep this group together, physically, morally, psychologically, until a window opened in the wall of mountains. He prayed not to be right, but to be worthy of the trust the dead had placed in the living. 16 nights into their exile, the mountains stopped being background and became an attacker. The wind had howled all day, a kind of throat singing that made the fuselage vibrate. They stacked luggage at the open end as a windbreak, tightened blankets into a patchwork quilt, and lay down in the order they always did, like tiles, shoulder to shoulder, so that each person's heat became someone else's salvation. Then, without warning, the world fell. An avalanche dropped from the slope above like a fist, hit the fuselage and kept going, snow pouring through the broken tail like a white ocean into a sinking ship. The light vanished. The air vanished. What had been shelter became a tomb. Those who were closest to the opening were swallowed first. Those near the back felt the weight climb up their legs, their chests, their throats. Cries turned to muffled knocks, prayers to fragments. Time collapsed into a single task. Do not stop breathing. Hands found hands in the dark. Someone, later they would all claim it was someone else, kicked an air hole toward the ceiling-turned wall. Canessa counted breaths aloud to calm panic. A metronome of survival. Parrado clawed with bare fingers until his nails ripped and bled, widening a fist-sized vent into a mouth of air. The snow pressed with the patient strength of geology. Against it, human will felt like paper. But paper, when layered, can hold surprising weight. Inch by inch, gasp by gasp, they remade a pocket of life inside the mountain's body. When silence returned, it was not peace. It was inventory. Names. Who answered? Who did not? The list of the living shortened. The grief arrived like a second avalanche, this one inside the ribcage, and with it, a return to the ethical precipice they had crossed days earlier. The dead were no longer strangers to cold. They were the very people who had warmed your feet last night, who had shared jokes about the sun like it was an unreliable friend. The consent that had been given in theory, if I die, use me, was now searingly literal. Some thought the avalanche had been a judgment. Others called it an accident in a country made of accidents. The argument, if you can call it that, lasted an hour and a lifetime. Did this catastrophe nullify their earlier vows or confirm them? The decision that emerged was sober, almost liturgical, their promises held. To refuse now would be to let two deaths occur, one to the body, one to the meaning they had built around survival. They would honor the same boundaries, prayer, naming, no faces, no hands. They would rotate the ones who kept the air hole open. They would share what little heat they could coax from the living and the dead alike. The practical problems multiplied. The avalanche stole space. Bodies lay stacked by physics, not preference. CO2 pooled when the vent drifted shut. Someone had to stay awake with a stick to keep it open. Frostbite crept across toes, quiet, opportunistic. To eat was no longer merely to plan for an expedition. It was to keep hearts beating in a sealed room. Canessa treated fainting spells and the small arithmetic of hypoxia. Wake them, shake them, measure their response. He later said the hardest part was not the act of cutting, but the act of explaining again and again why dignity could survive here too. He did it with the only currency he had left, presence. He sat with the ones who trembled, listened to the ones who felt stained, and reminded them that shame does not feed you, but love can. Outside judgment often imagines cannibalism as a moment, one forbidden meal. In truth, it was a discipline. Rationing, ritual, refusal without punishment, gratitude without spectacle. After the avalanche, that discipline took on the severity of a monastery. They turned mealtimes into intervals, small and regular, to keep minds from slipping into panic or apathy. They maintained a moral economy that matched the physical one. The stronger broke trail when it was time to scout, the weaker guarded warmth, guarded stories. Each role dignified the other. Psychologically, the avalanche did something paradoxical. It crushed them closer, yes, but it also dissolved the last pockets of magical thinking. No private rescue was coming for any one person. Only a collective could make it out. That realization fortified the consensus. We live or die as a team stopped being a sports motto and became a metaphysical claim. The decision to consume human flesh, already the scandal of their story, began to read from the inside like a covenant. My body for yours, if fate chooses me. Your breath for mine, if fate chooses you. At night, the fuselage sounded different. Snow dampened the wind's tantrums, so every whisper seemed amplified. Some spoke to the dead as if they were only sleeping one row behind, not out beyond the hull, in a new kind of silence. Parrado dreamed of ridgelines. Canessa organized a mental hospital in his head, assigning beds to symptoms he saw and naming them so they would not own the boys who carried them. Terror, guilt, longing, resolve. Language again, as a way to lift weight. This is the point where many viewers look away, not from gore, but from moral vertigo. Yet the truth is steadier than our imagination. They did not become beasts. They became caretakers of one another's survival and of the dead's legacy. The avalanche could have shattered their fragile ethics. Instead, it proved them. If you're in the 1% who can feel the cold in your lungs just reading this, you might sense why. In a sealed, breathless dark, the only light left is the meaning you make together. In the weeks that followed the avalanche, the survivors did something that rarely appears in headlines. They built a constitution, not on paper, ink froze, but in behavior, words, and repetition. Rules became rituals, and rituals became the structure that kept minds from splintering. They called it many things in conversation: our agreement, what we promised, how we'll do this. But it functioned like a covenant. It bound the living to the dead and the living to each other, and it made the scandal of their diet carryable. Consent was the first stone. Canessa repeated it like a pulse. I give mine, you give yours. They spoke for the friends already lost, not to erase their autonomy, but to honor what they had said while breathing. Some had written notes early on. If I die, use me. If I live, I will tell your family how brave you were. Others gave verbal permission over and over when the cold made thinking slippery, as if to laminate the agreement against doubt. Consent transformed the act from theft to trust. Without it, food would have been fuel soaked in shame. With it, food became a message. I choose your life even if mine ends. Second came boundaries. They were simple and strict. No faces, no hands. Name the person. Pray before and after. Share fairly. Allow refusal. Each rule solved a moral problem. Avoiding the face protected personhood. Naming protected memory from dissolving into utility. Prayer protected meaning from corrosion. Sharing protected the community from fracture. Refusal protected the conscience. A few attempted humor as pressure relief, dark jokes that admitted the horror without letting it own them. But the line between survival and mockery was never crossed. The rules carried them when willpower alone could not. Third came transparency. They did not lie to each other about what they were doing or why. Whispering hid the act from those not ready, but among those who partook, euphemisms had an expiration date. Protein became our friend's gift. Cutting became preparing. Language did not erase the taboo, it redirected it into reverence. This is a psychological truth. When the mind must host the unthinkable, naming it with care gives it a room instead of letting it roam as a ghost. They also established roles. Vito Strauch handled tools and efficiency. Parrado scouted, eyes always measuring horizons. Canessa tended to bodies and moods, the medic of tissue and conscience. Others specialized in melting snow, repairing blankets, massaging numb feet back from the edge of frostbite. Purpose is an antidote to despair, and each role was a reason to stand up when lying down felt like the last honest option. The Covenant had an economy. It was not a market, it was a ledger of responsibility. Those who ate today were obliged to carry more tomorrow. Those who couldn't bring themselves to eat were still owed warmth and inclusion. No one was allowed to drift into exile within the group. When a member weakened, quiet, not dramatic, the strong noticed and redistributed tasks. It was unspoken triage, and it saved lives not only by calories but by dignity. This too was ethical. The decision to survive could not justify neglect. Faith was braided through everything. Some saw the communion metaphor as literal, others as a scaffolding that let them climb over a chasm of disgust. A few wrestled openly with God, not asking for rescue anymore but for the courage to remain honest. Their prayers shifted from "send a plane" to "make us worthy of the ones we loved." In that shift, the moral focus moved from outcomes to character. They could not control the weather. They could control whether they kept their promises. From outside, ethicists sometimes stage the debate as utilitarianism versus deontology, survival outcomes versus inviolable rules. On the mountain, those categories melted into each other. The survivors pursued the good, life, the chance to return children to their mothers. By honoring rules, they believed preserved their humanity. They did not say, anything goes because we're starving. They said, only what keeps us human goes. The act the world would judge most harshly was wrapped in more care, not less. Psychologically, the Covenant performed a miracle of its own. It distributed guilt until it weighed less on any one person. Shared decision-making meant shared burden. When someone faltered, struck by a wave of revulsion or a nightmare that painted the fuselage with accusation, another would sit close and recite the terms again. Your friend gave consent. You are not stealing. You are carrying him forward. In therapy language, they were doing exposure and cognitive reappraisal without textbooks, approaching the trauma in small, controlled doses and reframing it within values they all understood. They also planned for testimony. If anyone made it out, he would tell the story straight. No euphemisms to the world either. That vow would later scandalize and then humanize them, because the truth ignores no one's comfort. But on the mountain, the promise to tell it without shame did something subtle in the present. It prevented the rot that secrecy breeds. A lie held in the chest can become a second hunger. Honesty fed their sense of worth. The covenant did not solve everything. People still broke down. Some days, spiritual language felt like threadbare cloth against a storm. But when choices are repeated, they become character. The men in the fuselage became the kind of people who could live with what they had done because they had done it for one another, not at one another's expense. That distinction is the hinge on which their morality turns. And so, when the time came to attempt the expedition out, when the white wall had to be climbed by bodies fueled by friends, the covenant traveled with them like a quiet drumbeat. It had turned scandal into sustenance and sustenance into responsibility. It had made them ready not only to survive, but to deserve survival. After the avalanche, time stopped feeling like days and started feeling like promises kept in sequence. Each morning they woke into the same negotiation. Keep breathing, keep the air hole open, keep the covenant. But beneath that routine, an idea matured like a seed forcing its way through ice. Someone had to leave. Waiting had turned into a form of dying. Action, even if it failed, felt like a return to dignity. Who would go? The answer was as much physiology as fate. Nando Parrado had become a compass in human form, eyes fixed on contours, knees that still answered when called upon. Roberto Canessa balanced steel and softness, medic's eyes, runner's lungs, a mind that could carry paradox without breaking. Others could support, scout, or prepare, but these two had the blend of endurance and clarity the mountain demanded. The choice wasn't romantic, it was triage. If the expedition worked, everyone's chances rose. If it failed, the group would lose two pillars. That risk carried its own moral weight, and they felt it. They began to plan with a precision that bordered on reverence. They stitched a sleeping sack from aircraft insulation and scraps of cloth, the closest thing to a womb they could carry into the killing cold. They crafted sunglasses from aluminum and plastic to keep snow blindness away, knowing blindness here was a sentence. They assigned roles for the days they would be gone: who would ration, who would tend the sick, who would keep the vent breathing, and rehearse them as if a coach were watching. Purpose spread like warmth. Then there was the most controversial detail of all: what food to carry. The same logic that had scandalized the world would now travel with them across ridgelines. They prepared small, dried portions, carefully, discreetly, because weight was life, and denial was death. The ethics did not change because the scenery would. The consent given in the fuselage extended to the trail. Still, the act of packing it felt new and raw, like putting a friend's name in your pocket. If the covenant meant anything, it had to mean this: the dead would go with them, not haunt them. The night before they left, farewells sounded like vows. No one tried to be noble for show. Nobility gets frostbite. They spoke plainly. If we don't come back, do this. If we do, we'll come back with a rope and a road. Canessa checked pulses, bandaged blisters, touched foreheads as if to take a last reading of everyone's spirit. Parishioners and priests without vestments, they prayed, in Spanish, in whispers, with hands and breaths. The prayer was not for miracles, but for character, to keep choosing each other when fatigue made selfishness look efficient. At dawn, the mountain offered its single currency: clarity. The air was diamond hard. The snowfield above them, which from inside had looked like a slope, revealed itself as a wall. The first hours were not steps, but negotiations with gravity. Parrado broke trail, hips and knees burning. Canessa matched him, measuring pace against oxygen, hope against hubris. Behind them, faces pressed to the fuselage, opening like shipmates at a porthole, counting their figures against a white canvas that erased men with a shrug. Ethically, leaving was its own dilemma. Is it abandonment to walk away, or is it stewardship to go seek help? The answer, they decided, lived in accountability. They were not escaping. They were extending the group's reach. They left instructions, not goodbyes. They carried more than food and fabric. They carried representation, every mother's face at home, every friend's consent. The climb converted survival from a private struggle into a public errand. This mattered because purpose is a better fuel than fear. Mid-climb, moral questions came in different clothes. When your heart hammers in thin air and your calves cramp with each step, guilt can masquerade as gravity. Why them and not me? Canessa, who had spent days holding other people's shame like a fragile thing, now had to manage his own. He did it as he had for others, by restating the covenant aloud, by remembering names. He was not consuming a friend, he was being carried by him. To stop was to waste that gift, to continue was to honor it. They reached a ridge, and the world did what worlds do in epics. It expanded just when triumph seemed earned. Beyond the summit lay not a clean descent into Chile, but a cathedral of peaks, more teeth, more white on white. The vision could have been cruelty. Instead, it was instruction. The path was longer, therefore the patience must be larger. They adjusted plans without tantrum. Food would stretch thinner, rests would be shorter. They would aim not for a miracle, but for a shepherd, a road, any sign that human beings still threaded valleys somewhere below. Nights on the mountain were arguments with physics. The improvised sleeping sack saved them. They learned to lie like spoons inside a pocket of warmth that could be torn by a single careless move. The ethics of the fuselage became the ethics of the bivouac. Share, forgive, correct gently. In the tight dark, Canessa's thoughts returned to the boys they'd left, their faces lined up in memory as if he were checking a ward. He promised them, one by one, to keep walking in the morning. Promises, repeated, make a spine. From the outside, the trek is sometimes told as adventure. It wasn't. It was a continuation of the moral wager they had accepted inside the plane, that life, chosen together, can be made worthy even when the means offend our settled comfort. Each footfall was a syllable in that vow. The 1% who truly understand are not just those who imagine eating to live, they are those who can feel the weight of leaving and the duty of returning. At first light on the third day, a faint seam in the horizon looked darker than snow should look. It might have been rock, it might have been cloud, it might have been the edge of a future arriving by inches. They aimed for it, not because they knew, but because hope, if it's to be moral, must attach itself to direction. And they kept going. On the third morning, the sky looked scrubbed clean, a blue so severe it felt like a rule. Parrado and Canessa rose out of the sleeping sack with the stiffness of old men and the focus of surgeons. Each movement had a cost and a consequence. Each breath was a debit against a tiny account. They ate with ceremony, measured pieces, a prayer whispered into scarf-wrapped mouths, and began again to write footsteps onto a page the wind kept trying to erase. The climb stopped being dramatic and became administrative. 100 steps, pause. 50 steps, pause. 10, sometimes 2. They learned the mountain's grammar. When ice crusted, you walk like glass. When powder deepened, you walk like memory, slow, uncertain, repeating what you know in case you've forgotten it. They spoke little. Language combusts oxygen, and they needed both for other tasks. When they did talk, it was to keep the covenant audible at altitude. Names, gratitude, promises. for Zerbino, for Fito, for everyone sleeping under that wing of snow. Saying the names turned calories into meaning and meaning into fuel. Ethics traveled with them, not like a shadow. Shadows vanish in white, but like a thread through cloth. The food in their pockets was the most controversial object they would ever carry. It didn't accuse them, it obligated them. We cannot waste this, Canessa would think, not as a scold, but as a vow. The gift the dead had given would be honored by movement, not hoarded by fear. If he faltered, he would remember the boy whose consent he had heard like a bell in the fuselage. Take what you need and live. Survival ceased to be a private appetite. It was a promise to be kept in public someday, to mothers who deserved their sons back, or, if not that, an honest account. A false summit taught them humility, the way a teacher uses silence. They reached a crest that had impersonated a finish line all morning, only to see a choir of peaks beyond, taller, more austere. Despair scratched at the door with cold fingers. Parrado knelt as if tying a boot, but really to order his mind. The map is larger than your hope. Enlarge your hope. Canessa stood beside him, counting heartbeats, the way he'd counted breaths during the avalanche, not to diagnose, but to anchor. They did not curse the mountain, they adjusted. Ethics often looks like adjustment, recalculating without betrayal, choosing again when circumstances move the goalposts. Afternoons were the worst. The sun tricked them with light that gave no heat. Snow glare gnawed at their eyes behind the improvised sunglasses. Muscles went from fire to ash. In that margin, guilt can masquerade as insight. Who are we to live when others died? But guilt without action is a luxury they could not afford. So they rehearsed a different script. We carry them. If we make it, we will return. If we don't, this is still the right errand. Moral clarity did not cancel fatigue, but it kept fatigue from turning into surrender. They slept another night inside their stitched cocoon, a two-person sanctuary in a world that didn't believe in shelters. Body heat pooled, breath frosted. At intervals one would wake to listen, an old fuselage habit for the small alarms of a companion's suffering. You good? A gloved hand on a shoulder answered more than words could say. The ethics of the bivouac were the ethics of the fuselage. Watch over the other. On a mountain, selfishness is efficient for an hour and fatal by nightfall. Morning finally offered a revision in color, a faint smear of brown in a horizon that had been all bone white. Rock, maybe, or less snow, or the promise of trees far below. The sight worked on them like a vitamin. Parrado's pace quickened by imperceptible degrees. Canessa recalculated rations with the confidence of a medic who believes in tomorrow. In any ordeal, a glimpse of after steadies the soul's hands. They did not call it salvation, they called it a direction. As they angled down from the ridge into a valley of broken ice and wind-scoured ridgelines, they found tracks, subtle stamped loops where nothing human had walked. The print of an animal, life. The world below hadn't ended just because their world had. This realization carried a moral undertone they both felt. Your suffering is not the universe's center. That humility is not self-erasure, it's alignment. It transformed hope from a craving into a participation. You rejoin a living world, you don't demand a new one. The descent exacted its tax. Knees throbbed. Toes, half numb, sent confusing reports, pain and absence arguing in the same sentence. They moved like careful thieves stealing distance from a fortress. When they stopped, they said the names again. They spoke to the boys who had refused to eat for days and then finally said yes, to the ones who never could and were loved anyway, to the ones who had given consent with clear eyes and cracked lips. Saying the names kept them honest. It was insurance against the moral amnesia that sometimes accompanies success. Late that day, the white relented a little, torn by ribs of rock. Wind smelled different, less sterile, more like something once alive. Parrado and Canessa looked at each other and allowed a small, unguarded smile. They had not defeated the Andes, no one does, but they had matched a piece of it with human resolve and an ethic durable enough to survive thin air. That ethic, consent, reverence, fairness, responsibility, was not a footnote to their journey. It was the reason the journey could continue. For viewers at home, warm and well-fed, this is the chapter where the story tilts from tragedy toward triumph. But the tilt is not built on luck. It is built on hundreds of small, honest choices about food, about each other, about truth that stacked up like steps across a chasm. Only a sliver of people will feel how heavy those choices were, how every bite and every footfall braided together. If you are among them, you know what they knew. Hope is not a feeling. It's arithmetic. You add what you can, subtract what you must, and carry the remainder forward. The first brown earth felt like a rumor. After days of white, even a rock the size of a fist looked like a door. Parrado and Canessa angled down a rib of ice into a valley where wind had shaved the snow to the bone. The air smelled different, less like freezer, more like stone warmed by light. They followed the valley, as if it were a sentence finally pointing toward a verb, and by afternoon they heard it. Water. Not melt trickling from a cornice, but a river speaking in full voice. They reached the bank and stared. The torrent was glacier cold, braided with foam, too wide and wild to cross with their wrecked legs. But the sound itself was medicine. Rivers mean valleys, valleys mean people, people mean roads. Hope, which in the high ridges had been arithmetic, 10 steps, then 5, became directional again. They followed the flow, scanning for footprints or fence posts, for the geometry of human intention laid over wilderness. Late in the day, they saw something that didn't belong to the mountain, a cow path, pressed into the mud like a signature. Parrado laughed a short, astonished sound. Canessa knelt and touched the track as if it were a relic. Life had been here, recent, domestic. They camped beside the river, inside the stitched sleeping sack that had already kept them alive more than once, and made a plan built on patience. Follow the river at first light. If we see anyone, don't frighten him. Speak clearly. Ask for help without wasting words. Morning washed the sky a hard blue. They walked. Around one bend, a figure on the opposite bank appeared, small at first, then resolving into a man with a poncho and the posture of someone who lives outdoors. A muleteer, an arriero, human. Parrado and Canessa waved, shouted, voices cracking into fragments. The river took their words and shredded them. The man cupped his hands and yelled back. Nothing carried. For a moment, the absurdity threatened to break them. Salvation within sight, separated by noise and water. The Arriero, later they would learn his name and thank him until language felt thin, made a sign. Wait. He disappeared and returned with bread and a pencil and paper. He wrapped them in a small stone and threw across the current. The bread arced like a blessing, landed short, spun away. He tried again and again, until a bundle struck the bank at their feet. Parrado grabbed it, unwrapped it with shaking fingers, and handed the paper to Canessa. Hands that had fashioned goggles from aluminum now had to fashion a sentence that could cross a river and a moral universe. Canessa wrote the truth. Not the whole exposition. There was no time for the theology of consent, for the covenant of the fuselage, but the core. I come from a plane that fell in the mountains. We have survivors. We need help. The pencil dug like a chisel. The paper tore a little where his hand shook. He tied the note around a stone and threw. It fell short. Parrado retrieved it and threw again, as if he were tossing a rope made of words. The Arriero caught it, read, looked up with a shock that turned instantly into purpose. He pointed. Tomorrow. He patted his chest. Help. Then he rode hard down the valley. Silence rose and settled over the river. Parrado and Canessa sat with their backs against a boulder, and for the first time since the avalanche, they allowed themselves to imagine rescue as an event, not a theory. With imagination came the other inevitability. how to tell what they had done to live. They had rehearsed honesty to themselves and to each other. Now they would owe it to strangers. Would the world understand consent, spoken in a fuselage of snow? Would priests say what some had whispered, that life given freely is not theft? Would families be able to see love underneath a word that had teeth? Psychology names this moment anticipatory shame, the fear of what others will see when they look at you. Canessa felt its edges and answered it the way he had answered his companion's tremors, by reframing. If we are honest, shame cannot metastasize into secrecy. If we speak the names, the dead will not be reduced to provisions. If we tell how we decided, together, reverently, then even those who recoil can at least see the shape of our choice. Survival is not immune to judgment. It must be able to survive judgment too. They spent the day in a holding pattern that felt like flying in place. They ate measured rations with heads bowed, not out of superstition but gratitude. They slept in the sack and took turns listening for hoofbeats. Toward evening, above the river's constant speech, they heard a distant clatter like stones arguing. A group appeared, more muleteers, more color against the scrub. One shouted and pointed, a pantomime of "Stay tomorrow." The men lit fires on their side, smoke rising like writing against the sky. Signal for the night, proof they had been believed. Morning brought instructions hurled across the water. "Wait here, we go get help." The muleteers left in a hurry that reassured. Urgency meant belief. Parrado and Canessa moved downstream in parallel, keeping the human trace close, as if the presence itself were a rope. By midday, they reached a place where the river braided into channels. A tug-of-war began between desperation and prudence. Wade or wait. The Covenant decided for them. You don't throw your lives away now. Too many are tied to you. They waited. In the pause, they talked about the boys back at the fuselage, how the news would travel, how many days the rescue might take, who would cry in relief and who would collapse from the release of tension. They imagined faces in the door of a helicopter, the shiver of rotor wash, the shock of color, red crosses against white. They also imagined the first hard questions. Did you? Yes. How? With consent. Why? To live and to return for them. These rehearsals were not PR. They were moral preparation to prevent the old covenant from fraying under the new world's gaze. Late afternoon, a man on the far bank called out a string of names: Spanish, local, kind. He mimed eating, then crossed his hands over his chest and opened them outward, a gesture somewhere between apology and blessing. He could not know the specifics of their taboo, but he intuited the shape of the wound. Canessa raised a hand in answer, the universal sign of thanks. Ethics can be argued in journals. Sometimes it is recognized in a stranger's eyes across a river. That night they slept without the terror of being alone in a world that didn't know them. The next day would bring soldiers, ropes, questions and plans. Rescue was no longer a myth, it had a schedule. The moral weight did not evaporate with hope. It took on a new assignment, to be carried into society without distortion or shame. "We will tell it straight," Canessa murmured in the dark. Parrado squeezed his shoulder. The river at last sounded like a road. Morning returned with hoofbeats and human voices sharpened by purpose. The muleteers reappeared on the far bank with more men, more gestures, and the unmistakable cadence of plans. One cupped his hands and shouted, "Helicopters!" The word leapt the river better than any sentence. Parrado and Canessa stood very still, as if a sudden move might frighten the future away. After 72 days of improvising life, someone else was finally writing the next line. They were ferried, first by pantomimed instructions, then by a rope across a calmer braid, to a shepherd's hut patched from boards and weather. Bread, broth, blankets, the sacrament of civilization. A radio crackled, and the room changed as if someone had opened a door in the mountain itself. Names were exchanged. Coordinates were tried on like new clothes. How many survivors? A dozen, maybe more. Where? Parrado described the valley, the ridge, the scar of aluminum half buried in white. Canessa gave the details a medic gives: injuries, frostbite, exhaustion. The men around them listened with the silence of people converting words into roads. Then came the first soft questions that meant everything and nothing. How did you live? Not, what did you do? That would come later, with the microphones and the headlines, but the gentler preamble. Canessa's eyes flicked to Parrado's. They had rehearsed this moment on the riverbank. We lived because we chose each other, he said. We lived because our friends gave us their consent to use what we had. The room absorbed the meaning without theatrics. One old man crossed himself, another nodded slowly, as if he had seen winter bargains before. Ethics did not need a courtroom. It needed witnesses. By afternoon, the valley began to vibrate. A low thump built into a physical thing, rattling tin cups and ribs. The helicopters arrived, olive shapes with red crosses and open doors, the industrial perfume of fuel cutting through the cold. Soldiers jumped down, light on their feet, eyes already measuring distances and weights. Parrado ran toward them like a man running toward the sound of his own name. He climbed aboard with a rescuer and pointed, arm rigid, turning memory into a compass. Canessa followed in the second machine, carrying not only directions, but a ledger of faces he refused to leave in the mountain's book. From the air, the world rearranged. The white that had been a wall became a map. The fuselage, a wound in the skin of the Andes. The pilot banked, circled, and set down on a tenuous pad carved by wind. The door slid open, and the old life, the one with engines and speed and specialists, stepped into the chapel of their ordeal. Boys spilled from the fuselage door with eyes gone huge. Laughter and sobbing arrived together like twins. Hands met hands. Names were shouted, then counted. It is possible to feel your soul gain weight. Logistics took the lead. Ethics kept the rhythm. The strongest would board first to make space and ensure the second day of flights could land. The most fragile would receive the medic's attention and careful rations left behind. No one would be abandoned, not merely in body, but in meaning. Before each liftoff, they repeated promises that sounded like a psalm. We'll be back. Tell them we're here. Canessa moved down the line, checking pulses, looking into faces the way a lighthouse looks into weather. You're going next, he told one who shook his head in refusal. You carried us in the nights. Let us carry you now. The helicopters could not take everyone in one day. Altitude taxed the rotors. Daylight had its own moral mathematics. The pilots dropped the first group in the green world of a Chilean valley. Grass, trees, smells that felt indecently alive, and went back up. Reporters had already gathered like weather, but soldiers formed a human buffer, giving the newly rescued a corridor of mercy between cameras and soup. In a corner tent, a chaplain squeezed hands and spoke blessings that did not pry. Canessa heard one phrase as if it had been said into his own ear. What you did to live, you did with love. He exhaled a breath he had been holding since the first whisper of protein. Night drew a line the machines could not cross. A medic stayed at the fuselage with supplies, a promise in human form. Down below, Parrado and Canessa were asked again, now by uniforms and notebooks, how they had survived. They did not varnish. Consent, reverence, fairness, these were the planks of their bridge back to society. It wasn't a defense, it was testimony. They understood the price of truth. Some would recoil, some would debate, some would do the rare thing and try to imagine the cold. But secrecy would have been a second kind of death. The second day, the sky returned on schedule, a miracle treated like a plan. The last survivors were lifted out, faces tipped to the rotors, cheeks wet with a relief so heavy it looked like grief. As each helicopter settled in the valley, the circle widened. Doctors, blankets, calls to families that began with sobs and ended in silence, the silence of a mother holding a telephone like a relic. And woven through it all, the moral thread held. The dead had not been used. They had been honored. The living had not escaped, they had been entrusted. In the hours that followed, Parrado and Canessa made one more decision of conscience. They would visit the families of those who did not return and tell them not only the last words, the bravery, the prayers, but the truth about how their sons had saved their friends even after death. It was not a confession, it was a recognition. The covenant had always pointed outward, and now it arrived at its destination, a world that would be asked not to approve, but to understand. From afar, rescue looks like an ending. Up close, it is a beginning full of delicate tasks, healing bodies, answering questions, translating a mountain's ethics into city light. Only a small fraction of people will feel the full gravity of that translation. The 1% willing to ask themselves, what would love require of me in the cold? For those few, the helicopters are not just machines. They are answers that sound like questions. You lived. Now how will you tell it? Hospitals smell like soap and second chances. After 72 days of metal, snow and breath measured in rationed prayers, the survivors woke under white ceilings that did not leak cold. Doctors spoke in the clipped grammar of vitals and charts. Families spoke in the long grammar of names, kisses and tears that shook beds. Then microphones arrived, and the ordeal needed a translation the world could hear. Reporters asked the questions society always asks when horror has worn a human face. How many? How long? How did you live? The first two answers fit into headlines. The third required a kind of courage the mountain had trained them for. Roberto Canessa did not deliver a defense. He delivered a testimony. He explained consent, the agreement spoken when hope was a rumor and starvation a fact. He described the rituals, prayer, naming, boundaries, and the refusal some chose without penalty. He spoke gently, the way you speak in a chapel, because for him the fuselage had been won. He said what he had said to his friends in the dark, if I die, take what you need. I give you my body so that you can live. He did not ask the world to applaud. He asked it to imagine the cold. Nando Parrado matched him in candor, though his role was different. He carried the narrative outward like he had carried footsteps into the white. We did what we had to do to come back, he told cameras with the gravity of a man who knows what words can and cannot do. And we came back for them. The them here was twofold. The dead, whose gift had traveled in the muscles of the living, and the families who had kept candles burning over empty beds. Ethicists and clergy entered the conversation with varying vocabularies, but often converged on mercy. In the city's heat, with abundance humming in refrigerators, people tried to adjudicate starvation's courtroom. Utilitarians spoke of outcomes, 16 lives saved. Deontologists wrestled with the sanctity of the body after death. Virtue ethicists asked whether character had been preserved. The survivors' account complicated simple verdicts. They had not eaten because they despised taboos. They had eaten because they revered life. They had not turned savage. They had enacted a discipline, consent, reverence, fairness, refusal without punishment. These are not the habits of beasts. The press wanted images, the men offered language. Communion was the word that had made sense at altitude, and now it made sense in parlors and pews. Not because they confused theology with logistics, but because they needed a way to say that love had been the engine inside an action the world calls by an ugly name. A mother listening could hear in that word a bridge over a ravine she had not asked to cross. My son was not consumed. He was received. For some, that mattered. For others, the shock was too bright to see through at first. The survivors accepted both reactions without bitterness. Judgment is a human right, so is testimony. Psychology names what happened next in the survivors' hearts. Survivors' guilt met moral injury and tried to take up residence. Nightmares arrived, along with the phantom sensation of cold in warm rooms. Canessa recognized the symptoms in himself and his friends: startled responses, intrusive memories, tears that felt like ambushes, and applied the same medicines they'd practiced in the fuselage. Tell the truth, say the names, distribute the burden. "If any one of us carries all of it," he told a friend in a hospital hallway, "he will break." So they visited rooms and shared the weight like they had shared the sleeping sack, close, honest, unashamed. Then came the visits to families who had candles without bodies. Here too, they refused the anesthesia of euphemism. They told last words and last jokes, bravery and fear. And when the moment arrived, they told how love had continued after breath stopped. Some mothers wept with a sound that scraped the soul clean. Some placed a hand on a cheek and said a sentence that would steady the men for years. "Thank you for telling me the truth." In those living rooms, ethics left the debating halls and took a chair. Whatever the world might say, the covenant had kept faith where it mattered most. The broader culture digested the story in its noisy way. Books, arguments, late-night commentary, a kind of fascination that sometimes mistakes itself for understanding. "Only 1% will really get it," someone remarked. And perhaps that number isn't scientific but spiritual. The true minority aren't those with iron stomachs. They're those willing to feel poverty in the bones for a minute, to imagine the avalanche's weight, the sealed air, the inventory of food that stops at zero, and then to ask, "What would love require of me?" Years turned the story from scandal to parable. The survivors built lives: medicine, business, family, the everyday heroism of paying bills and remembering birthdays. The mountain did not vanish from them. It became an interior geography, a place of vows they still kept. Canessa carried his patience with a tenderness sharpened by memory. Parrado spoke to audiences, not to polish his legend, but to rescue other people from private avalanches, marriages in crisis, griefs without language. A teenager who needs to hear that meaning can be made from pieces. And always, when asked about the decision on the mountain, they resisted the temptation to make it pretty. Suffering can be adorned by storytellers until it looks like art. Theirs remained a duty. They taught that taboo is not a toy for the bored, it is a guardrail that only crumples under the heaviest trucks. If you live in a world where the guardrail has never been tested, give thanks. If you ever find yourself at its edge, bring reverence with you. The moral dilemma at the center of this story cannot be outsourced to philosophers or absolved by applause. It is an invitation. Not to approve or condemn from a safe distance, but to imagine the cold and choose compassion, to admit that hunger can turn commandments into questions, and that sometimes the most faithful answer is the one that keeps a promise to the living and the dead at once. That is what they did. That is what they tell us. The rest is up to us. The world loves a clean parable. The Andes offered a not. In the months after the rescue, opinions arrived like weather fronts. Hot takes, cold condemnations, soft rains of compassion. Television tried to compress the ordeal into segments whose music could steer your feelings. Dinner tables rehearsed verdicts between courses. Universities assigned essays. Churches and synagogues and living rooms turned the survivor's choice into a mirror and found their own reflections looking back. Mercy, fear, disgust, awe. The scandal of the act became the scandal of our reactions to it. Roberto Canessa learned a new kind of endurance, not frostbite and altitude, but questions that pierce without malice. He answered with the same steady grammar he had used in the fuselage. Consent, reverence, fairness, refusal without punishment, because repetition is how you build a bridge sturdy enough for strangers to cross. He did not pretend the decision had turned beautiful. He insisted only that it had been honest. Nando Parrado carried the tale into auditoriums with a calm that made listeners trust the quiet between his sentences. He did not sell heroism. He sold clarity. "We lived because we chose each other," he would say, and leave a pause long enough for the room to measure its own courage. Ethics classrooms adopted the case. Utilitarian readings praised outcomes. 16 lives, future families, grandchildren who owe their birthdays to a taboo broken with care. Deontological readings strained against the sanctity of the corpse and found their way back through the door, marked consent freely given. Virtue ethics asked a more intimate question. Did the men become more or less the kind of people we hope to be under pressure? Their covenant, prayer, naming, boundaries, fairness suggested that character, like a tent in high wind, can be secured by many small stakes. Psychologists mapped the invisible wounds. Survivors' guilt tested friendships with sudden silences, moral injury, ambushed sleep with films no one else could see. Yet alongside the damage, clinicians recognized post-traumatic growth, the stubborn sprout that pushes through ash. Purpose deepened. Gratitude arrived without fanfare, most visible in the way coffee was savored and ordinary Tuesdays became sacred. Some survivors married, raised children, built businesses, cared for strangers as if care were a renewable resource. The mountain, though, never moved out entirely. It lived in their calendars like an anniversary that is both funeral and birthday. The communion language that had held them at altitude continued to hold in earthlier rooms. Not all believers agreed, and not all needed to. But for many families, that word built a bridge over a canyon too wide for analysis alone. My son gave life, a mother could think, hear, or say, and the sentence would land not as an argument, but as a lullaby for grief. Outside faith, the metaphor still worked as an ethic. The dead were not used, they were honored. That distinction matters because the same act can be desecration or devotion depending on the story you tell while doing it. Some critics accused the survivors of romanticizing the unthinkable. The men declined the bait. They did not turn their ordeal into a brand. They told it straight and allowed listeners the dignity of their own discomfort. Honesty does not demand applause. It invites courage. And courage, here, meant imagining the sealed fuselage, the counted crumbs, the avalanche that turned breath into a currency, and then admitting that your judgments may soften when your bones start to ache with borrowed cold. Years layered perspective. The site in the mountains became a place of pilgrimage for some, quiet visits, prayers for friends, a landscape that had taught them the arithmetic of hope. Down below, anniversaries gathered families into the same room where laughter could coexist with tears without either one apologizing. New readers discovered their story in books and films. New debates lit up old concepts. The survivors kept their promise. When tellers drifted toward spectacle, they guided them back to covenant. When questions sought gore, they offered gratitude. They refused the degradation of either denial or sensationalism. The moral dilemma at the center of their tale turned out to be less about cannibalism and more about consent and community. Starvation stripped them to first principles. Your life is my duty. If fate takes me first, take what you need and carry me in your muscles and your memory. That vow preserved personhood in a setting designed to erase it. It is a hard teaching in an era that confuses freedom with isolation. On the mountain, autonomy survived only because it was woven into belonging. There is a reason only a sliver of people, call it 1%, truly understand. Understanding here is not an intellectual trick. It is an act of imagination disciplined by empathy. It requires you to let the cold into your lungs for a minute, to smell aluminum and fear, to count the hours by light that doesn't warm, and then to ask your conscience, not your appetite, what fidelity looks like. It might look like exactly what they did. Name the dead, accept their gift, share without cruelty, and keep walking for the sake of the many. You do not have to approve to perceive the love braided through the scandal. If there is a legacy beyond survival, it is this. Their story recalibrates the word unthinkable. Much of what we call unthinkable is merely unexperienced. When experience arrives with the force of an avalanche, thinking must stretch or shatter. They stretched it with prayer and promises. They kept it from tearing with fairness and truth. In a century hungry for heroes who are complicated and kind, their testimony offers a rare combination. A refusal to lie about horror and an insistence that love can govern even there. The Andes did not grant absolution. Mountains do not care. What the survivors received instead was something more demanding and more humane. Responsibility. To live as men worthy of what was given. To tell the story without trimming it to fit comfort. To visit mothers, to look them in the eyes, and to say the sentence most of us hope never to need. Your son helped keep me alive. That is not closure. It is continuation. The covenant fulfilled in city light. When the headlines faded and the bodies healed into their new geography of scars, one question kept returning like a tide. What would you do? It is easy to answer from a couch, harder in a fuselage sealed by snow, hardest when your ribs click as you breathe and the calendar has forgotten your name. The survivors of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, October 13th, 1972, the Andes, did not bring back a moral trophy. They brought back an invitation no one enjoys receiving. Imagine the cold, then choose. Roberto Canessa has always refused the theatrics of certainty. He does not say the decision was beautiful. He says it was faithful. To life, to friendship, to consent spoken clearly while hope was still a rumor. He reminds us that they bound the act with vows. No faces, no hands, speak the names, pray, share fairly, allow refusal. Those rules were not decorations. They were the scaffolding that kept character standing in gale force wind. Nando Parrado carries the same truth in a different register. Quiet resolve. We did what we had to do to come back. And we came back for them. The them includes the dead, whose consent traveled in the muscles of the living, and the mothers who deserved the dignity of an honest account. Ethics in classrooms separates into neat lanes, outcomes, duties, virtues. Ethics in a white coffin on a mountain braids them. The survivors pursued life, a utilitarian good, without abandoning respect for the dead, a deontological duty, and protected the kind of people they wanted to remain, virtue. Consent turned flesh from property into gift. Ritual turned eating from secrecy into stewardship. Fairness prevented survival from becoming a private hoard. None of this sterilized the act. It made it answerable to God, to conscience, to the families whose sons would never come home. Psychology adds its own lens. Starvation distorts thought. Isolation corrodes meaning. Shame multiplies in silence. Against that chemistry, the group practiced an unwritten therapy. Speak the truth out loud, distribute the burden, keep promises. They named their friends before receiving the gift of their bodies, so memory would not collapse into utility. They allowed refusal, so conscience could breathe. They reframed the unthinkable in a language their hearts could lift. Communion, not as a slogan, but as a way to declare, love will govern even here. This is what people mean when they say only 1% will understand. Understanding is not appetite, it is empathy trained to hold paradox without blinking. And you, what would you do? If your answers feel crisp, hold them to the light and see if they soften in imagined cold. Would you accept your friend's consent? Would you give your own? Would you protect someone's refusal without letting him die of shame? Would you share, measure, and pray so that your survival did not curdle into cruelty? The survivor's testimony doesn't demand agreement. It demands honesty. They didn't hide. They told their mothers the truth. They visited graves with gratitude rather than apology. They built lives that honored the gift, patients cared for more gently, children raised with a deeper patience, strangers helped as if scarcity had left instructions. There is a quiet sequel the cameras rarely film, the long discipline of telling the story straight again and again, so no one else has to carry it alone. The men return to the mountain in memory, and sometimes in person, not to worship suffering, but to keep their vows company. In the valleys, they stood between sensationalism and denial and chose the middle place where dignity lives. They made of their scandal not a brand, but a service, a mirror for anyone facing a different kind of avalanche, addiction, grief, the wasteland of a hospital corridor at 3 a.m., and needing proof that love can organize horror into something survivable. So this is the moral of a story that resists morals. Taboo is real, and it protects real goods. Don't break it lightly. But when the guardrail crumples under the heaviest truck, when the choice is between extinction and a vow kept with reverence, the survivors of Flight 571 testify that humanity can still prevail. Not by erasing the horror, but by arranging it within promises, consent, naming, prayer, fairness, refusal without punishment, responsibility after rescue. The dead were not used, they were honored. The living did not merely live, they became custodians of a gift they will never finish repaying. Perhaps the 1% are not a secret club of the strong. Perhaps they are those willing to borrow the mountain's air for a few minutes and ask their conscience a better question. What would love require of me if the world went white? Sit with that. Don't rush your answer. The Andes did not forgive or condemn, they simply told the truth. Now it is our turn.